All right, folks. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so today we're going to talk about, today is the lectures on global competition and internationalization. And one thing is that this is a topic that I find very fascinating. It is, believe it or not, though, it is actually a bit of an embryonic topic. And what I mean by that is you will see during these slides, for example, I'm going to present to you 3 different frameworks that are pretty helpful for understanding global strategy choices, right? And the objective there isn't to overwhelm you. It's because the state of the research on this is still a little bit all over the place, right? And you'll sort of see some disagreement on that, right? But it's a very fascinating topic. This is actually, today, although I've talked about global strategy both as an academic but also worked on global strategy issues, this is actually the first time I've ever lectured on global strategy, right? So this is all created in the last week, this material that you're going to see here, these slides, right? So the fact that it's my first time ever doing a lecture on global strategy means 2 things. One, I will probably screw up at least a few times during this lecture. But 2, I also don't have 120 different slides to give you. So, so next year, by the time I do this next year, those guys will get the 120 slides, you know. So this might be a little bit less time constrained and also a little bit less content constrained. But also on that topic, I would encourage you, I want you to understand the process that goes into, for example, these supplemental readings that I do. If you're interested in this, I really encourage you to look at some of the supplemental readings. I try to make sure, because the process, for example, here, what I do is I have dozens and dozens of articles that I look at as potential things both for me, just to educate myself and get the concepts, as well as potential for students. And then I narrow it down to what I think might be supplemental or essential. Then I narrow it down to what's essential. And I don't just throw stuff in the supplemental either, right? Because if a student comes in and asks somebody, I realize, wait a minute, if they come in and ask a faculty member about the supplemental reading, the faculty members better have read it. So in other words, what I'm saying is that I've got to minimize that. But they are chosen very judiciously. And you'll see that I'm going to talk about some things that I think are most important in today's lecture, right? But if you look at things like some of the supplemental readings for today on global strategy, right? There are things like, globalization in the age of Trump. Very interesting about what happens, in that regard. There's a globalization in the defense industrial base. That topic will come up again later in the course, right? But again, sometimes there's things I can't get to here. But if you're interested in them, just at least look at those titles and consider it. They're all posted on Blackboard. And again, if it's something you're interested in going into more depth, I do not just throw those things up there with no reason. There's a lot of effort that goes into picking those things out, right? But I also understand, I don't expect most students to read the supplemental, right? But it's there for you, and just so you know the process that goes into that, and they are, sort of, if you will, filtered, appropriately. All right, so on that, so where are we again? I always sort of like tell you where we are. We are still in the conduct portion of the course, right? This is the portion of the course where we talk about what firms do, right? The choices they make. And if you remember, what we did was we started off by saying, okay, in Module 2 of the course, we said, let's take a relatively static view of the world, right? Understand the environment in which we're competing, look at the industry environment, right? Understand within that environment, how do we position ourselves, right? Within that environment, right? In terms of advantage, scope, activities, right? And then what we've done in the last 3 modules, Module 3, 4, and 5, is said, okay, take this static world and either add change or complexity to it, right? So, and the first thing we did was we added the time and dynamics. Things change. The static worlds do not exist, right? The world is dynamic. How do you respond to things like industry change, innovation? Then we added the idea that yes, many firms are not just competing in one business unit. If one particular product or service, right? They have multiple products and services, multiple businesses, right? And so why? How does that make sense? Why do they do that? How do their choices make? That's the idea of corporate strategy. And then now we're getting into the idea of global strategy, right? So the idea is that we have international, the idea of cross-border, sort of strategy, global strategy. It's like choices that come into play when you can compete, and or trade with different nations. Now, this is different. You may think that we started this module actually without the lecture. Usually every module so far has been a lecture the first time, right? But sort of to lay the groundwork where we're going, etc. I intentionally chose to wait till the second lesson of this module to do this discussion of global strategy, right? Because I wanted to make sure, because the very first thing you got to understand, right, which is what we talked about last time, is you got to understand, the idea of of comparative advantage. The basic ideas of comparative advantage, why countries trade, right? Why individuals trade, why firms trade, but more generally, why do countries trade? Why do we have international trade at all, right? What do we think about that in terms of, and what dictates the patterns of trade, right, across countries? And that was something that was better achieved in seminar. Whether you did the exercise or something else, it was better achieved in seminar, so I did that first, right? And then said, okay, now, for this lesson, now think about it, going back to the central question of this conduct portion of the course, is what does that mean for what businesses do, right? So now, with this lesson here, we're talking about, okay, instead of focusing on countries and how countries trade, how does internationalization affect business choices, business strategy choices, right? How do they, when they think about this idea of whether it's trading across international borders, right, locating internationally, right, locating operations internationally, how does the fact that with internationalization of markets affect global competition and global strategy? And so now we're getting into so our focus now is on the industry and on the firm. So what I wanted, as I mentioned, there is more that I could possibly cover, right, in 90 minutes, right? And that's why I sort of was advertising for some of the supplemental readings. So I had to pick out what I thought was the most important topics, and these are what they are. There's actually, even in your essential readings, there's some things that I'm not going to hit today. I'm not going to hit about the, sort of the structure of, how you manage multinational corporations, just because I think it's less relevant than these topics, not irrelevant, but less relevant than these topics for me to emphasize in the lecture. And so you'll sort of see what I'm talking about is we're first going to understand the scope of international, or the magnitude of internationalization, right? There's a lot of talk about it. The world is flat, the death of distance, right? There's no such thing as national markets anymore. Everything is global now, right? Is that true or is it not, right? And then we're going to talk about, okay, then this idea about internationalization of industry structure. How does industry structure drive internationalization, but also how does internationalization affect industry structure? And then internationalization and firm performance. Right? So the idea is what do we know about how firms perform, and how well they do when they begin to incorporate global strategy, trade internationally, these sorts of things. And then the idea of internationalization and global strategy. So the idea is, and there's a fair amount about this, I already mentioned the 3 different frameworks in there, to understand, if you want to look at a firm and understand the choices they're making with their global strategy, how do we characterize it, understand the choices that they make? What are the dimensions upon which firms make choices in their global strategy? And finally, a little bit of foreshadowing for our next lesson, right? So I've got some stuff on the end, is the idea of when you choose to locate individual activities, how do you choose to locate your different activities that you as an organization, how do you think about choosing where to locate them, right? And that is, as I mentioned, foreshadowing, preparing for the next class, because the next class is a case study on Intel choosing where to locate an assembly and test plant, right? They're looking at choosing, should we locate it in China, Vietnam, Thailand, or India, right? And so we're going to put you in the shoes of Intel at the time of that decision and figure out how they would make those choices. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of ammunition today. You'll get more in your reading for that next class, but give you a little bit of ammunition today to think about that problem. All right. So first, internationalization, how much, really, right? And so the idea is, look, I grabbed these numbers from a book called International Strategy by David Collis in 2014. So I'm not even sure exactly what year these numbers are, but you can grab, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. I can grab any statistic to tell you this, right? But there's a lot of things to suggest that there is a significant amount of internationalization, right? International trade in goods and services exceeds $30 trillion annually, right? Financial flows daily of $5 trillion, cross-border financial flows, right? Also, in general, if you look at if you add up, both exports and imports, not exports minus imports, right? Not your GDP formula, but you add up exports and imports. How do that compare to overall GDP, right? It's a big portion. In the U.S., it's a big portion, but in Europe, right? Not surprisingly, right? It's even higher, right? So there certainly is evidence that the suggestion that internationalization is affecting, sort of business trade and the sort of the behavior of industry and firms. And multinationals account for about 20 to 30% of world output, right? 45% of S&P 500 profits are international. So again, this evidence suggests that. There's also, what does that mean, for patterns, economic patterns going forward? So this is a research by HSBC that looked at sort of projected. This is back, I think it was done in 2012, and they looked at what they looked at was the GDP of the top 30 economies in 2010, right? And you sort of saw, so the total world GDP, $37 trillion, right? And you see that most of that at that time was from what they call developed markets. Right? But they're projecting by 2050, right, that in fact a majority of world GDP among the top 30 economies will be what are considered emerging economies. Right? And these, of course, most notably in this classification is China, right? But China, India, Brazil, right? So, but again, this idea that what's happening is not only that we're having more international trade, but it's changing the relative balance of how significant different countries are in the global economy. Now, that said, right, this is sort of this idea of globalization, right? As I mentioned, some popular books, The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman, or The Death of Distance, right? Everything's globalized, right? Well, one of the supplemental readings that I gave you is by Pankaj Gamawat, which is called The World is Not Flat, right? He feels very strongly about that. The world is not flat, right? And in particular, here's some data from that. He points out, he said, look, well, first he says, you know, you ask people, well, how much do you think of, you know, how much do you think of the U.S. budget goes to foreign aid? How much of, you know, trade do you think is international? How much? Any questions about internationalization and globalization, people tend to overestimate it. They think the world is, they believe the world is far more global than it actually is, right? And he has, in that article, he talks about his 10% presumption, right? The reality is, if you take, you know, whatever measure of different things, whether it's telephone calls, patents, stock investment, how much of it is actually cross-border? How much of it is actually international? And he says, ballpark it, a good guess is always 10%, right? The point being, in general, 90% of all these things are still done domestically, right? That yes, internationalization is growing, globalization is important, you have to be aware of it, but it is not something that has happened yet. And in particular, distance still matters. It's a title of another one of your supplemental readings. Distance still matters. And even when you do have international trade, a lot of it tends to be much more on a regional basis, not really global, right? It's international, right? But it's international trade with your nearby partners. All right, so, and here's just an example again, is that remember last year, in the last class, if you looked at sort of the idea, we modeled imports and exports, and we looked at this idea of the world price, right? That if you open your borders, you trade, there's a world price for goods, right? Well, that's great, that's a good approximation, it's a valuable model, but it's not real, right? The reality is there still are big differences, even within the Eurozone, when people can trade with each other, when there's sort of free trade among them. If you look at, this is the idea of different sort of, the percentage difference between the highest and lowest price within the Euro area for different goods, right? The point is, you know, and we'll get to this idea of arbitrage, there still are significantly differences across countries in terms of the price of goods and services, right? And so the idea is it's not one big world market, at least not yet. All right, so here's another one. This is data from 2005, looking at the Fortune 500. So these authors, Rugman and Verbeek, I guess it's pronounced, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, Verbeek, I don't know. But looked at the Fortune 500 and tried to classify them based on where they do business. Right? That of the Fortune 500 firms, how many of them are truly global? In other words, they were in at least 3 regions, not 3 countries, 3 regions of the world. They actually did business 3 regions. The answer is only 2% of the Fortune 500 did business in at least 3 regions of the world. About 7% do business in 2 regions, right? 3% are actually host region focused, which is interesting, which is, so they have a home region and a host region, so they do most of their business in a given host region, right? But 88% of the Fortune 500, they classified as home region focused, meaning at least 80% of their business was in their home country, right? And so again, this idea of globalization matters, right? But does not overstate what's going on. And in particular, it's not because I'm trying to minimize it. If it was, if I said globalization doesn't matter, see ya, you guys could go, because the lecture would be over, right? But, and maybe you'd like that. But the point is that it's to understand what's holding back globalization, right? Because when global strategy is going to depend upon the things that are holding back or limiting globalization, right? Things like distance between countries, barriers to going into, barriers to international trade and foreign direct investment. All right. So with that said, so the idea is that basically the reality is that if you sort of do a frequency histogram, if you will, of industries, right? There are there are no industries that are completely globalized, where it's just one world market, and there are probably very few, if any, markets that are completely localized, right? But the reality is most of it is in the middle, what we call semi-globalization, right? So some degree of globalization for most of these industries, particularly ones that you're going to be looking at, right? But the idea is that your home country still matters, right? There still is a fair amount of localization that's going on. All right, so that's the idea of understanding the true sort of dimension or measure of internationalization. Now, the first thing I want to say about, okay, once we understand that it's going on, I want to understand this idea of tying it all the way back to business economics. What does this mean for industry structure, right? So both how does industry structure drive patterns of internationalization, and then how does internationalization drive industry structure? So first, so this is classic sort of model of different industries. So the idea here is that the nature of the internationalization for an industry will depend upon its fundamental economics, right? So in other words, industry structure will dictate the nature and degree of internationalization. And here's what I mean by that. So what we're mapping out here, on the vertical axis is international trade. What do I mean international trade? What I mean is literally imports and exports, trade across borders, okay? Right? I'm trading across borders, either importing or exporting. That's international trade. Foreign direct investment, sometimes abbreviated FDI, right? So be aware of that if you see that abbreviation. That is not trade across borders. That is actually me buying assets across borders, right? So instead of me trading with that country, I'm actually going to build operations in that country. I'm going to build a plant. I'm going to buy a company. I'm going to have foreign investment in that country, buying assets in that country, right? And so if we map out the level of international trade, low versus high, and foreign direct investment by industries, we can sort of categorize industries into these four different categories that are driven by their industry structure. So, for example, in the lower left, we have what are called sheltered industries. Not a lot of international trade and not a lot of foreign direct investment. Right? So what type of industries are these? Right? These are industries like where being local matters. The idea of taxi service. You can't really trade I can't sell taxi services to a foreign country, right? You've got to be there, right? A lot of services, laundries, hairdressing, etc. Right? So again, the idea that it's something that there's, fresh milk, you can't tend to trade across borders, right? You've got to be local, right? But also there's not a lot of people going, you know what I want to do? I'm going to actually go and I'm going to buy a hairdresser. I mean, I've got an operation in France and I'm going to buy a hairdresser in Sheboygan. Right? That's not happening in these industries, right? That's to be foreign direct investment. So these are what we call sheltered industries. They're basically, primarily still sort of domestic industries. Now, if we go along this dimension, so we still have low international trade, but we have so we have high foreign direct investment. So these are issues where now there are benefits to actually, companies will buy an operation or buy assets in another country, right? But there's not a lot of cross-border trade. What does that mean? Things like hotels, right? The idea is that, Marriott, Sheraton, right? They have global operations, right? But they're not selling across borders. They're choosing to have foreign direct investment in different countries. Things that are hard to trade across, frozen foods, right? Again, these are things that you're not going to do a lot of, international trade, right? But you might, if you are, a big into frozen foods, you might decide to buy operations in different countries. There might be a benefit for you to be present in different countries, but you're not doing a lot of cross-border trade in that. That's the idea of multi-domestic industries, right? So the idea of, again, multi-domestic, it's still domestic, right? But the idea is that you might have operations in multiple countries. This will have a parallel later when we talk about multinational industries as well later. Now, in this dimension, what about this idea of where we have high international trade? So a lot of cross-border trade, but not a lot of foreign direct investment, right? So think about these things like shipbuilding, military hardware, right? These are things where the idea is there's a benefit. You don't do, there's no reason I can't build a ship here and literally ship it over there, right? I can trade across borders. I don't need to buy a shipyard somewhere else, right, to get into that market. Well, sometimes they might, depending upon regulations, but based on industry structure, and also there are often, obviously military hardware, there are restrictions on your ability to do that, right? We'll talk about CFIUS, and things like that later in the course as well, right? But also things like, where the idea is if you're going to be in diamonds, you got to be where the diamonds are. If you're going to be in rare earth metals, you got to be where the rare earth metals are. If you're going to be in agriculture, you got to be where the agriculture is, right? So in other words, you're not going to invest in agriculture in a country where you don't have good agricultural conditions, right? So, but you will trade cross-border. It's not hard to ship wheat and corn and things across borders. there's no need to actually make foreign direct investments, particularly if you're going to locate where you have the optimal production of agriculture. And then finally, this idea of what we call truly global industries, or where you have both, where it's goods where there is an advantage. You can trade oil, automobiles, semiconductors. You can trade them across countries, but there's also an advantage to actually having locations there, right? We'll sort of see, in the Intel case, we'll see semiconductors, right? We'll see the idea that Intel will have operations in different parts of their value chain in different locations. So you trade cross borders, and you will choose to locate certain portions of your business in certain localities. So you will have foreign direct investment. You do buy assets in those industries, right? Now, but again, I want to emphasize that this is not just sort of, oh, let's map them out by data, right? The idea is, it is because of the industry structure that this dictates, right? Certain industries, nobody's surprised that hairdressing, there's not a lot of international trade. It's the nature of the industry that dictates which one of the boxes you fall in, okay? That's what I understand. This is how industry structure drives internationalization. Now let's go the other way around. How does internationalization affect industry structure? And there's a portion in the grant reading that talks about that, right? And it's accurate but incomplete, right? For example, right? It says, look, when you internationalize, your customers, actually says this bullet, says your customers can buy imports now, right? So that they have more bargaining power. Customers get more bargaining power because they can buy from imports or new entrants, right? So the idea is that internationalization, supposedly, according to that text, increases bargaining power of customers. But I say, wait a minute, not so fast. Maybe, right? But also, you have access to customers internationally, right? Your customers will say to you, you know what? You're not giving me a good deal. I'm going to buy that Chinese import from you instead. So yes, there's more bargaining power with your customers that way. But if you also say, you know what? If my domestic customers aren't buying what I want, now I have the whole world to look at where I can find the most attractive segment of buyers who are least price sensitive, most interested in what I'm doing. So the point is, it goes both ways. Your customers have access to international sources, and you have access to international customers, right? And that is which effect prevails, right? Which one, who gets more options because of globalization? And the same thing here with suppliers, right? Think about this idea that, look, so because now suddenly your supplier, the bargaining power of suppliers, well, now instead of being beholden to your domestic suppliers, you could now look globally for the best source of supply, right? We'll talk all about supply chains later, right? You can look globally for the best source of supply. So you've lowered the bargaining power of your suppliers because you now have more options. But they also have the opposite effect too. They can say, you know what? Now that we have internationalization, I can sell to whoever I want to globally. I don't have to sell to you either, right? As you have internationalization, again, so the idea is you got to figure out, it'll depend industry by industry which way it goes, right? Who ends up having more options due to globalization? Now the reading talks about, it says, threat of new entry. How does globalization affect the threat of new entry? Well, obviously, when you have globalization, you have new entrants, like almost tautologically, by definition, right? You have either foreign direct investment or you have imports, right? So now you have these new entrants because of globalization, right? Which is certainly true. But I want you to understand the causality goes both ways, right? It's like globalization, then you have new entry. Yeah, but why did you have globalization in the first place, right? Well, something must have happened. Why was it not globalized before? There must have been something that happened to barriers to entry to allow globalization, right? In other words, globalization means lower barriers to entry. Lower barrier to entry means globalization, right? I don't want to get too complicated, but understand, I just had concern with the grant reading because it acted like these things only go in one direction. What about rivalry? This is sort of an interesting phenomenon. I mentioned this in the syllabus. One of the questions I said was understand what happened to rivalry. In particular, there's a number of things that drive rivalry, but let's think about it in terms of fragmentation versus consolidation. So remember, the idea is, in general, the more fragmented a market is, in other words, the more sellers there are, the more intense the rivalry is, right? The more competitors, more intense the rivalry is. The fewer competitors, the less intense the rivalry. Okay, so what happens with globalization? Do industries consolidate when they globalize, or do they fragment when they globalize? Well, the answer is both. On a national level, if I measured the, sort of the concentration of a market on a national level, the idea is we used to have our domestic suppliers, now suddenly we globalize, now there's new options, new firms competing. So now we have more firms competing domestically, which means we fragmented the national market. But the biggest players globally now can even get bigger because they can expand in other markets. So you actually can have consolidation globally and fragmentation nationally, right? So again, I just wanted to emphasize that it can go both directions. And finally, again, Grant doesn't talk about this one, but threat of substitutes, right? Understand the reality is that at the same time that your industry is globalizing, your substitute markets might be globalizing too, right? And in fact, they might be globalizing more rapidly, right? Think about, for example, what if you are in the book selling business, right? And in ebooks, right? Ebooks is going to globalize much faster, right? That is, anything that's sort of information driven, as things globalize, as communication networks get better, these sorts of things, your substitute industry might actually globalize even faster than your industry. So you might have, because of globalization, the threat of substitutes might go up, might go down too, right? Again, I'm just trying to tell you there's no easy answers here. It ultimately comes back to understanding the nature of that industry. The effect that industry structure will depend upon the industry. All right. In terms of so this is the idea of globalization. Now, the other thing to understand while we're on the topic of 5 forces is the idea of okay, so remember this diagram here. This diagram, this is probably presented in business economics. It's actually straight out of the Porter 5 competitive forces that shape strategy reading, which was assigned for BE9, right? And he said, look, there's this difference in profitability across industries. Some industries over extended period, 19 to 2006, tend to have significantly higher return on invested capital than others. And the idea is you have certain industries, airlines, year after year after year tends to be an unattractive industry, right? Pharmaceuticals, year after year after year tends to be an attractive industry. And the idea was that was motivating the 5 forces. Say, we can understand this because if we do a 5 forces, we will understand, a 5 force analysis will tell us, why soft drink concentrate is so profitable. It will tell us why pharmaceuticals are so profitable. It will tell us why airlines are so unprofitable. And so that's what he used to motivate this. And so you might look at this and say, oh, okay, so pharmaceuticals is an attractive industry. Well, that's not what the data says. It says pharmaceuticals in the US is an attractive industry. And airlines in the US are an unattractive industry. Okay, but you might say, well, okay, but come on, airlines are kind of the same. You got to have a plane. The structure of the industry should be the same, no matter what, no matter where you are. Well, no, right? In fact, first eye chart of the lecture is this one, right? So this is some research that was done by Tarun Khanna and Jan Rivkin about the structure of profitability around the world. And what they did was they said, look at a bunch of industries and see, basically what they did was they created this diagram for all the different countries, right? And they sort of said is, what's the correlation across countries, right? If an industry is particularly profitable here, Italy, right? So it is, if the industries that are profitable in Italy, how correlated are they with the same industries that are profitable in the number of, say Chile, right? Number 6 here, I don't know. So but the idea is to figure out what's the correlation. Do the industries that are profitable in one country tend to also be profitable in another country? The answer is not so much. All the yellow says those are all things where there's no statistical significance. The idea is the fact that you tell me this is a really profitable business in Israel. For the most part, look, Israel looks like it's all yellow all the way across. Tells you nothing about how profitable it will be in some other industry, another country, right? So again, the idea is industry structure will vary across countries, right? Now, some of them, the red pluses, right? So these are where there is a positive correlation. The blue is actually a negative correlation. In other words, if you're making money over there, you're probably losing money here and vice versa, right? So the idea is that, so this is important for globalization because companies assume it's an attractive business here. I'm doing what I'm doing here, I will do over there. Well, you're going to screw up because what makes you successful here might very well not be what makes you successful over there because it's going to be a different industry structure, a different industry environment. All right, so again, this is just sort of the idea of a cautionary tale about sort of globalization. Right? By the way, there are some things in the same research. They looked at the idea of what sort of characterizes these red pluses, where there was positive correlation, right? And they tended to be countries that had similar levels of development, similar currency regimes, high average level of development. These sorts of things, tended to mean that they tend to be correlated, right? But you'll see that in most cases, you have far more yellow. If you add the yellow and blue together, far more of that than you have of the red. Right. Okay, so that's internationalization industry structure. Any questions so far on this? Okay. So the punchline being that industry structure will tend to dictate the form of internationalization, right? But also, the idea is that that internationalization will have an impact on industry structure, but it depends on the industry. And moreover, right, industry structure varies dramatically from country to country. Okay. Internationalization of firm performance. Okay. So we know the world is internationalizing. We got globalization. Okay. How's that working for you? Right. Well, the answer is not so good as my old gig. Right. So this is a chart from 1990 to 2011 from CompuStat data on operating margins for publicly traded U.S. firms. And the idea is, how are they doing in terms of their margins in their domestic operations relative to their foreign operations? And you see consistently throughout, the foreign operations underperform domestic. Right? Even in years where maybe things in the U.S. aren't doing so well, there's never a year in which it's reversed or even really gets that close. There's always an advantage in terms of profitability to the domestic operations for these firms. Right? Okay, well, why? Right? Well, understand some language you should use. One of the ideas is this idea of liability of being a foreigner. This is a concept that goes back to very early work in global strategy. Right? And not surprising, right? The idea is, first of all, there might be things that are costs or regulations that disadvantage you as a foreign entrant. Right? There's certain barriers that they put upon you as an entrant, maybe because of the government, maybe because of cultural, maybe other institutions, where it's harder simply to do business as a foreigner because of certain costs or regulations. Also, the idea is going back to remember this idea of corporate strategy. I told you, when you do corporate strategy of multiple businesses, it's not costless. When you have multiple businesses under your corporate umbrella, there's a cost to doing that. Right? Same thing globally. When you decide to operate in multiple countries, you increase your overhead. You increase certain costs, right? And so the idea is, again, there's a cost that's imposed upon you simply by having operations in diverse, that should not be diverse, like diverse geographies, cultures, and economies. Also, of course, as we'll get to in much more detail, you're probably unfamiliar with the customer preferences or supplier relations or competitors. You don't understand that environment, right? And I already showed you, if you assume the game over there is going to be the same as the game here, you're going to be sorely mistaken. And then there's this other idea of the paradox of being consistent, right? And this should have echoes of Coors. It should have echoes of Kodak, right? The idea being, we already said that global international environments are different. Industry structure is different across countries. So the idea is, to be successful in a given industry structure, what do you got to do? You got to identify a good strategic position. You've got to figure out what's going to be your advantage. What are your activities? You tailor your operations to that position. We said that tailoring is key to competitive advantage. But you're tailoring it to the US or to France or to Thailand or wherever it is. You're tailoring it to your domestic market. Your tailored operation will not necessarily translate directly internationally, right? We saw about what happened with Coors. They tried to just expand within the same country, go from a Western brewer to a national brewer, right? But the same idea with Kodak, going from film to digital, right? If you're really good at doing something, it can be very hard to then do something else, even if it seems like the same thing, but it's in another country, right? So in fact, sometimes you'll see that firms with the greatest advantage at home are often those most likely to fail when expanding abroad, right? Because the idea, the same things that make the formula for success domestically may be the seeds of failure internationally. All right, so again, these sort of explain this variability in performance between domestic and foreign operations. Give an example, Walmart. Right? So this is data from, I believe it's about 2003, I think this data is. It's about 10 years ago, maybe it's a little later than that. But this is sort of, this is sort of maps out Walmart's international operations. Look, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Canada, United Kingdom, Brazil, China, South Korea, Argentina, Germany, right? And so each one of these, by color-coded, represents a different country. The size of the circle represents the revenue generated in that market. The vertical axis is the margin, right? What's your operating margin there, right? 0 is here, by the way. So, below this is negative, right? Meaning not doing so good, in South Korea or China at this time, right? Or even worse, is this Germany? I guess Germany, right? But what you'll notice is the horizontal axis is distance, how far away it is, right? And there's a correlation, right? The farther away it is, your operation is, right, the less well Walmart does. And we can think about various reasons for that. I'll give you some more in a second. But again, distance matters, right? That we see that, again, your performance, will vary by your distance relative to your home country. Now, when we talk about distance, though, what do we really mean? Here, it just means geography. Literally, on the map, how far you are. But one of the key insights to understand is that when we talk about distance in global strategy, we got to talk more than just geographical distance, right? And so you have, again, in your grant reading, but it's also in one of your supplemental readings, this idea of the CAGE framework for assessing distance, right? And that really a much better proxy, if you want to look at what really dictates relative performance, it is not just geographic distance, it is distance measured in all 4 of these dimensions. And these dimensions are first, so these are cultural distance, administrative distance, geographic distance, and economic distance. That's why, hence CAGE, right? And so what do we mean by cultural distance, right? Well, these are things about different languages, ethnicities, right? Social norms, right? And again, so the idea is that Britain is very far from India, but culturally, at least because they speak English language, it's less of a difference, right? The idea that we tend to think about this idea that it's not just geographic distance, but also this idea of how different is that culture from one to the other. And which industries are most likely to be affected by that? Well, the first thing is, for language, obviously things that are linguistically, right? Things that require television publishing, right? So these sort of things are that have a linguistic, if you don't have the same language, right, it's very hard to export your good if it's dependent upon them understanding the language, right? Or cultural content. Think about food, wine, music, right? It's just not going to be, sorry, thinking of music, my son was watching Borat and his Kazakhstan music anyway, but again, not likely to translate from one culture to another. I know that wasn't a documentary. I know that, but still. But again, this idea that things that have a cultural component or a language component that's going to be a farther distance. You're going to be impacted much more by that distance. Administrative and political distance, right? The idea is think about the idea of you have a different monetary system, different political system, some hostility between the countries, that's never good, right? Weak legal and financial institutions, right? So the idea, again, if there's a distance between the countries based on an administrative or political system, what industries are most affected by that? Again, it's going to be where there are administrative and political influences, right? Government doesn't get heavily involved in some industries. It does in others. So any industry in which there's a heavy government involvement, strategic industries, all of our defense industries, right? These are going to be harder, right? Because that's where the administrative and political system is going to have a greater impact because they're going to care. They're going to care about those industries, and it'll be harder to be successful there. Geographic distance, we already sort of talked about this, but when we think about geographic, we are still expanding it. It's not just as you measure it on the map, right? The reality, you could be very close, but even if you're farther away, if you have a good way to get from one place to the other, transportation, a river that connects you or something, right? A body of water, right? That might be a lower geographic distance. Also, communication, right? How easy it is to communicate. This matters most for, obviously, it's not as big a deal for information goods, things like that are easy to transfer or light things, but cement, right? If you've got a product that weighs a lot, but it's worth very little per pound, right, then distance is going to matter. You don't want to ship that too far internationally, right? Fragile, glass, perishable, milk, right? But also things that are dependent upon communication, right? Financial services, right? The idea of when you got to communicate a lot between countries, that is, again, an industry that is going to be impacted by the lack of communication links. And finally, economic distance, right? Think about this idea of macroeconomic measures, things like GDP per capita, right? The unemployment, right? Productivity per worker, right? All of these things, the labor cost per worker, these things are also a measure of economic distance, and that will matter, right? If you're trying to sell something with a luxury good, right, to a place with a low GDP per capita, good luck. You're gonna have some trouble, right? So again, that'll matter more for somebody selling a luxury than a necessity. Also, things that are labor intensive, right? Because if you're looking at labor cost, unemployment, we're going to talk about the Intel case. We're going to look at again on next class Thailand, China, India, and Vietnam, and look at their unemployment rate, the productivity per worker. All those things are going to matter for a labor-intensive activity, right? Less so if you don't need unskilled labor, but also if you need skilled labor. What's the availability of skilled labor too? Education levels, these sorts of things. All right. So, but again, the punchline here being that distance matters, but distance doesn't just mean as the crow flies. Okay. By the way, in terms of sort of distance, I found this amusing at least. This is sort of actually from Campbell's Soup. So Campbell's Soup actually has this chart of how countries like their tomato soup, right? Different countries like their tomato soup very differently. So we have from Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, all the way down to the UK, all alphabetical order here. And they say, well, do they like it creamy or as a puree? Do they like it thick or a liquid? Do they like it smooth or pulpy? Sour or sweet? Dark or light? What sort of herbs they want, right? And again, they've got a formula for how they've got to, now it's still tomato soup, but they've got, again, have to customize their soup to the local taste. So something even as basic as Campbell's tomato soup varies by country, by destination. Here's another one. This is actually from an advertisement by HSBC Bank, right? And it says, the tagline is never underestimate the importance of local knowledge. Football in the USA, football in the UK, football in Australia, right? Again, it means something different. And this may seem trivial, but by the way, if you look at what happened when Walmart went to Mexico, when Walmart first went to Mexico, they said, hey, we need footballs here in Mexico. They sent them footballs, American footballs, right? And it didn't work so well, right? So, but again, this idea that local knowledge matters, right? HSBC, by the way, is one of these banks. Some banks, like Citibank, is much more global, like sort of, we serve global customers with a global operations, right? HSBC positions itself like, no, we are a multinational corporation, but we focus on being domestically responsive. Our operations in each country are different because we have the local knowledge. So again, and this is in their advertising, they're emphasizing this. All right. So that's internationalization for performance. Any questions so far on that? All right. Yes, way back there. Oh, hey, Patrick.
What about a company like Uber? Is it limited by those cage frameworks as well as a platform?
Well, so we go back to this. So if you think about this, right? So you could imagine what would Uber face in each of these dimensions, right? Right. So the idea is certainly cultural distance, right? Do you get in a car with a stranger, right? That could be a cultural thing, right? Do you how many drivers do you have? Maybe you're in a country where certain people aren't allowed to drive, things like that. So again, that could be a cultural distance aspect as well, right? Administrative and political distance, we certainly know that, right? Uber is a great example of their ability to penetrate a market often depends upon the response of the local government to allowing them to come into that market, right? And we see this with the scooters out here now. How much is that going to be a protected industry? Do the taxis have political power, and that's going to limit the penetration of Uber? So again, that will matter for administrative and political distance. Geographic distance, right? I don't know if that's going to matter too much because it is an industry that is a multi-domestic industry, right? You're not trading across international boundaries, so I don't know that the geographic distance is going to matter as much. Economic difference, again, it could affect sort of the idea of both. One thing, by the way, is Uber might do very well in a country that has high unemployment, but high cars, right? People during the furlough, right? Became Uber drivers, right? Don't got a job, you got a car, you become an Uber driver. So again, the economic variables might also dictate the success of Uber. So yeah, so I mean, that's off the top of my head, but you pick an industry, right? So again, think about the distance, right? As you think, I mentioned in the syllabus, think about this, applying it to the countries you're going to visit, right, on your OCONUS travel, right? And the idea of, can you look at this and does that tell you, okay, why do we trade with that country? Why do we not trade with that country? Why does that country trade here? Does this give you any insights on that? All right. So now understand this idea of global strategy. So we sort of laid the ground. So again, we've talked about this idea of how much is internationalization, what's the trends in internationalization, what does it mean for industry structure, and we've talked about what it means for firm performance in general. Now this idea of now we make decisions. How do firms decide what they do in terms of global strategy? And what I mean by here is, we'll talk about location, right? Global strategy is not just about picking locations, right? How do we think about what locations we pick, how we configure them, how we operate our global operation, right? So I'm actually going to talk about these three frameworks, right? And so again, as I told you, because it's a bit of an embryonic field, right? You would think, obviously global strategy has been a topic for decades, but there still is, there's not like one recognized sort of framework. And so I thought, as I looked at different companies, I said, you know what? They fall into, each one of these frameworks helps explain some companies, but not all, right? And so, but they also said they're not independent. They actually overlap, and you'll sort of see this, right? So I'll talk about each of them and how they relate. But they have different, this is what I hated about business scholarship, right? Everybody's got to take the same thing and relabel it. They all have their own names for the same thing, right? But that said, So let's first talk about this idea of probably one of the oldest frameworks, certainly the oldest one on this chart, is the Integration Responsiveness Framework, primarily originally due to Chris Bartlett, was the first scholar to work on that. Others have done that, Prahalad, Doze, others have worked on that, right, since then. But so this idea of the Integration Responsiveness Framework. So what does that actually mean? So the idea here is that there are two driving forces, you know, or at least for this framework, they think about two driving forces for the nature of globalization, for natures of to drive global strategy. One is this idea of global integration. What are the forces pushing you towards global integration? In other words, doing the same thing, you know, as you go globally, doing the same thing across many different countries, right? So this idea of global integration, that everything, you know, you integrate all your activities. You expand internationally, but you integrate your activities and try to make sure you standardize across your different countries. Well, when would you do that? Well, if there's significant benefits of scale, right? The more you produce of this one product, right, the lower your cost. Well, then you want to sell the same one product everywhere, right? If you sell different products, you're not going to get the economy of scale. So you want to have global integration so you have an economy of scale. If experience matters, right? Experience is different than scale. Remember, experience is the idea that not about how much you produce now, but how much you've cumulatively produced over time, right? So the idea is the more we do the same thing over and over again, the lower our cost, the better we get at it, right? So again, you'll want to do the same thing across different countries. And replication. The idea is it easy to say, it worked here, put it over here, put it over here? Is your industry one in which it's easy to replicate? Those are all sort of you know, supply side or cost side issues that would favor integration. Also, global sourcing efficiencies, also a supply side driver. The idea that is there an advantage to being globally located, have all over the country with the same product requiring the same inputs? If you require the same inputs in all of your countries, right, then you can get global sourcing economies, right? I can get it cheaper. I buy in bulk all of my countries, right? I'm buying an enormous amount of steel or aluminum or whatever it might be because I'm having the same product in different markets. That's supply side. On the demand side, obviously, if you're going to sell the same thing in multiple markets, the customer's got to want it, right? So are there homogeneous customer needs? Is it such that, you know, the basic needs for this product in this country, this country, this country, at least the countries we're focusing on, are relatively similar? We can offer the same or at least a similar solution across markets, and customers want that. Are there, again, going back to the cultural, is there sort of some cultural convergence? Going back to Theodore Levitt decades ago, talked about as markets globalize, there tends to be some sort of cultural convergence, which makes it then easier to sort of penetrate those markets with the same product offering. Also, think about this idea of global customers, right? Think about Walmart, right? So if Walmart's going to offer, you know, you might want to have, Walmart wants to buy a certain input or a certain product to sell to its customers, say shampoo, right? And so the idea is, if you're going to sell to Walmart, right, and it's better to have your operations across all of your locations produce the same product because you can sell. You're selling to a firm that is also globally integrated, right? There's the idea of, is there a benefit of learning in multiple national environments? What I mean by that, there's always a benefit for learning. But in particular, does learning in Guatemala help me do better in Costa Rica? Does learning in Thailand help me in Vietnam, right? If they are completely different markets, no, it doesn't, right? But if they are similar, then the idea is that I want to do the same thing because if I do it over here, it works, I can then transfer it over here and do the same thing. And lastly, the last thing to think about is this idea of global integration is if you're offering the same product or offering across different markets, you're probably facing the same competitors. You know, because you are basically saying, look, I offer this product in these different markets, right? And my competitor are likely to be that as well. Well, one thing you will see is sometimes there's an advantage to having multi-market contact with your rival because we see lower levels of competition in multi-market contact. Why? Because the idea is, think about it, we're in a market where you dominate and I'm the follower. And you think, you know what, I'm going to crush you. And I say, really? Over here, I dominate, I'll crush you. Right? The idea is if we have multi-market contact, the idea is there's less incentive for you to compete intensely in one market because you might face consequences in another, right? Because they can cross-subsidize. I'm willing to lose money over here because I can punish you over there, right? So again, you sort of see that dynamic as well. So those are all forces for global integration. Now there's also, on the other side, forces for local responsiveness, right? The idea, instead of having a standard solution across markets, having a customized solution. Well, what drives that? Well, one is obviously differences in customers' demand. If they want different things, you got to offer them different things. You got to sell it to them, right? And this might be driven by, there might be, again, going back to the cage framework, differences in culture, regulations, institution, politics, or economy may require you to do different things in that location. Different channels or distribution, right? The idea is, in particular, if distribution is completely different in different markets, right, your business model over here, right, remember, when we talk about global integration, I'm not just saying products. I'm saying doing the same business model across different markets, which means same product, but also the same way of doing business. Well, guess what? If your distributions are completely different, you know, in one market versus another, right, the reality is that you might have to have a completely different business model, right? When I think about, like, one example I thought about was I actually, of all things, did work in the toothpaste industry in the Philippines, right? And it's amazing the volume of toothpaste that gets sold in these little small packets inside the very poor places where people will literally buy enough toothpaste to last them a few days, right? And you've got to distribute it by on bike, right? Very different than Colgate and Johnson & Johnson, Colgate Palmolive come in. They're trying to sell their Colgate and their Crest in the big stores. They're not getting to much of the market, right? So again, the idea is same product, but their business model had to change because of the local distribution conditions. All right, again, going back to the cage, if there are significant transportation, communication, or coordination costs, then the idea is I don't want to integrate, I don't want to coordinate country A with country B if it costs me a lot to do that. If it's hard to coordinate, then fine, let 1,000 flowers bloom, do your own thing. Right? Also, though, on the demand side, on the supply side, differences in labor or input conditions. Think about this. Suppose I'm producing a product, right, that, think about the iPhone, right? I always think about this. You have this vision of this high-tech iPhone, right? But if you look at the operations at Foxconn, it's incredibly labor-intensive. It's not like some robot putting your iPhone together, right? It's labor putting it together, because labor is really cheap, right? And they could do it with robots, but it's cheaper to do it with labor. Well, the same thing here. Think about the idea of if I've got an operation in this country where I have really cheap labor, but capital costs are high. Over here, I don't have a lot of labor, is more expensive, but I have automation, right? Then I will have to have a different business model. I'll produce the same product differently in different countries because of differences in labor or input conditions, right? Differences in infrastructure, right? Obviously, the idea of whether it's communication, utilities, these sorts of things could also drive how you do how you have to customize to the individual market. And finally, government protectionism, right? If a government says, you know what, to do business here, you got to do it this way. You got to come in as a joint venture. You got to do this. You got to do whatever. Over here, the government says, no, here you got to do it this way. Well, then you're going to have to do it have a different business model in different markets. So again, understand you have these two different forces, things that say do the same thing, as much as possible across markets, and do different things customized to individual markets. All right. So with that long explanation of the dimensions of our graph here, right? So now we can categorize. So now getting to the integration responsiveness framework, the idea is, if we map out here, the vertical axis here is the forces for global integration, right? How much of those things on the left side of what we just saw, how intense are those? Very much we want to have economies of scale, big integration, right? Sort of the standardization. Or how much is there a force in favor of local responsiveness? We got to make sure, that we do something very customized to our individual market. So the first so think about now again, so the category here, this is the idea of, look, we don't need to integrate across countries. There's low force for integration, global integration. So, I don't need to coordinate what I do in Guatemala, with Costa Rica, with Thailand, with the United States. I don't need to coordinate that, right? There's no real benefit to doing that. But we also don't need to customize it either. So basically, we can sell the same thing in different markets without really talking to each other, right? That is what this framework calls an international strategy. Right? And what the idea is, the role of the subsidiary is simply, hey, go sell. You sell in your market, because this product does not need to be customized. It can be sold in any market, but we don't really need to coordinate either, right? Now, here, the global strategy, this idea is, here we have strong forces for global integration. So it's important that we standardize, have economies of scale, learning. We do the same thing across countries. And we do not need to customize it to the local market, right? So we can do the same thing for multiple markets. But the benefits of that, what's the benefits of the global strategy? The benefits are some economies of scale, some coordination, some experience. There's some benefits from doing things across different markets. So the point is, you ultimately have to coordinate across markets. So the goal of the individual subsidiary is we say, look, we're going to have this strategy across businesses. Everybody in every country does the same thing, and we get scale benefits, et cetera. So the idea is I don't leave you alone, because we have to integrate what we can, right? But the reality is that you don't need to customize for your market. And that's the idea of a global strategy. It's global, but it's not customized to the individual market. Here is the idea of a multinational strategy, right? And again, these things might international, global, multinational, but understand the labels are less important than the distinction. A multinational strategy, this idea of, look, there's not a lot of benefits to economies of scale. There's not a lot of reason we've got to basically coordinate and do the same thing across countries. In fact, what really matters is that we are very locally responsive. We are tailored to this market, to our local market. Then the idea is the subsidiary is like, look, you do your thing. You do your thing because you know the market, identify and exploit the opportunity, exploit differences. What makes your market unique? Because you've got to be responsive to your market, right? And that's the idea of the multinational strategy. And finally, this idea of, this idea of the transnational strategy. That's sort of like the idea of what if there are benefits, there are forces for global integration. There are benefits, right? There are benefits to being globally integrated, right? Meaning there are benefits to doing some things, across all markets. But you also need to be responsive to the individual market, right? Then this idea of the transnational, right? And so then the issue is, the key there is, okay, how do we balance those two things? Right? How do we balance the benefits of integration with the necessity for responsiveness, right? And so this is where the role of the subsidiary is to basically, say, we want your role is not to optimize your market, right? Your role is to optimize what's best for the overall corporation, which means identify those activities which should be customized to your market and identify those other areas where we can globally integrate, right? And there's a whole book by Bartlett called Transnational Strategy about how to do that, right? But again, that is sort of a holy grail. It's very difficult to do in some sense, right? But so when you actually have to be domestically responsive, think about the idea of you're producing something with big economies of scale, but different markets want different things, right? That's a real challenge. How do you balance that, right? But again, let me use an example of General Motors. Remember, General Motors had a scale disadvantage to Ford. Right? Ford was much bigger than General Motors. General Motors recognized that they needed to have customized solutions. Different customers wanted different products, whether it be Oldsmobile or whatever, different product lines. So what did they do? They decided which parts of our operation are scale sensitive, and we're going to share those elements across product lines, right? So we're going to find out what's scale sensitive, where we want to integrate, right? We have platform strategy. So we share certain functions that are scale sensitive, but we then customize it to the individual product market segment, right? That's the idea of a transnational strategy, much more like General Motors than Ford. All right. So some examples. So here's the idea. Think about this idea of where we would map these out. Some things that, here we have cement, right? So this is the idea. This is sort of cement is, something where, really cement. You don't need it. You don't have special Indian cement, special, El Salvadorian cement. It's cement, right? So you do not need to customize it to your market, but you also, at the same time, there's not a lot of benefit of global integration, right? Again, you're not going to obviously be trading cement too much, internationally, right, across borders because of the weight, the price to weight ratio, right? Up here, think about jet engines, right? These are very scale sensitive, right? And so the idea is that the more you can sell the same jet engine, maybe to go into different jets. It could be different jets that goes into, but sell it across different national markets, the better you have global integration. And finally, down here, this extreme thing about funeral services, right? Funerals are going to be different in different countries. They're customized. Even in this country, you ever been to a funeral in New Orleans? A little different than in New York City, right? So again, the idea is that the funeral is going to be customized to the particular location, but there's not a lot of benefit to having an international, global operation in funerals, right? So again, this is the idea of the integration responsiveness framework. It is the sort of one of the oldest frameworks for thinking about different global strategies, right? So, and again, so we have there's international, global, multinational, transnational, right? Words that seem like synonyms, right? But they do mean something different. The most important thing to understand is that not necessarily the labels, but how they characterize different approaches to global strategy. All right, well, let's talk about this other framework, the AAA triangle framework, right? As you'll sort of see, it overlaps a little bit with the integrated responsiveness framework, right? In particular, what Gamma calls aggregation is actually what Bartlett calls global strategy. What Gamma calls adaptation is what Bartlett calls multinational strategy. But he does have this new idea of arbitrage, right? The third A here. So we'll talk about what that actually means too. All right, so the idea is, when we think about this AAA triangle framework, adaptation, right? This, as I already sort of hinted, is like the multinational strategy. The idea is you're adapting what you do to the particular market in which you're operating, right? So the idea is, again, adapting, optimize your product or service offering for local markets, right? So the idea is maximize your responsiveness to the local market, right? And one of the proxy measures that Gamma suggests is advertising. How much you spend on advertising. And think about it. If you have two global firms in the same markets, the one that spends more on advertising is more likely to be the one that's customizing to that market. Because if you have to have different products, different offerings, different positionings in different global markets, you're going to spend more on advertising, right? We talked about, advertising has come up in several case studies. The idea is the more products you have, the more products you have, the more you got to spend on advertising, right? So if you have different products in different localities, you're going to spend more on advertising. So one reflection of how much you're trying to adapt to local markets is your advertising percentage. Aggregation, this is about economies of scale. This is the global strategy, right? You're trying to standardize your product or service offering. You are trying to deliver economies of scale across a region or globally. Right? What's the proxy measurement for that? Not advertising. That's my typo. I'll fix that before I'll repost it with that. It's R&D. Not a perfect measure, but in general, if you have high R&D percentage, right, that is something you're going to want. If you're going to develop a product, you want to sell a lot. Big investment in R&D. You don't want to have different R&D, for different markets. But the idea is instead, if you have high R&D, you are going to want to do more of scale. You're going to do more aggregation. And finally, this is new for arbitrage. Okay? Probably heard the word arbitrage. Again, basic idea is sell low, buy low, sell high. Right? The idea is figure out. The idea is here is exploit differences between national markets or between regional markets, right? Find out where you can do this cheaply, where you can do that cheaply, and the idea is to locate parts of your supply chain and or your value chain of the firm, we'll talk about that in a second, in where you have a comparative advantage, where you can actually do things at lower costs, right? And so one of the ideas, a good proxy measurement for this that Gemwant recommends is labor cost as a percentage of sales. Why? Because firms that will tend to disaggregate their supply chain, disaggregate their value chain, are ones that have high labor costs. If you have a high labor cost, what are you going to do? You're going to locate that component of your operation that is high labor component. You're going to locate it in low labor cost countries, right? Think about Apple doing design in California, sourcing inputs from Germany and Japan, doing assembly in China, right? Again, because if you have a high labor cost, right, you're going to want to locate that activity in a low labor cost country. So these are imperfect measures, but they give you some reflection of how a firm is balancing these three possible approaches to global strategy. And so the idea is he then says, look, you can sort of take a firm or multiple firms and you can map them out. Right? And so the idea is here he has sort of how much adaptation you're doing is your advertising sales, how much aggregation is your R&D as a percentage of sales, how much arbitrage you're doing is labor as a percentage of sales. And so it's again an imperfect measure, but it gives you some idea of how you're balancing these. Right? Just to give you an idea, so this is the median. This triangle here is the median for U.S. firms. Right? So U.S. firms basically spend about an average of about 20% of sales on labor, about 1%, maybe less than 1% on R&D, about 1% of sales on advertising, right? So that's the median. The 90th percentile is this triangle here, right? So 90% of all firms, U.S. firms, will lie within, that triangle. Basically, actually, mathematically not quite, but that gives you that idea. If you're outside that means you're really heavily invested in one of these three dimensions. And so what he does is he says, we can take an industry and competitors and try to say, how is this firm different than this firm? And so I'll give you a couple examples. So this is actually in your reading on managing differences. He talks about Cognizant and TCS. This picture is not there, but he talks about the two firms. And they are both IT service firms in India, located in India, the global firms, right? We all know that we get IT help from India all the time, right? But the idea is if you can actually map out TCS, this is part of Tata, with Cognizant, you sort of see that TCS is doing far more aggregation, right? Whereas Cognizant is doing far more adaptation. Right? Cognizant is much more focused on customizing to the individual markets, whereas Tata TCS is much more focused on aggregating, getting scale across markets. Another example, this diagram is in the reading, right? What about diagnostic imaging, right? Look at Philips, GE, Siemens, right? And you can sort of see this gives you an idea of what is the different corporate strategies. Clearly, Philips is choosing to do much more adaptation. They're spending much more on advertising, right? They are customizing to the individual markets. These are all global firms, right? Customizing to individual markets. Whereas both GE and Siemens are trying to achieve economies of scale. They're doing much more aggregation than Philips, right? But we see that GE is doing far more actual arbitrage as well, right? They're choosing to locate their different activities, where they can get lowest cost, right? And it might not be surprising, that GE is the best performing of these firms, at least at the time of this data. All right. So, but again, it's a framework but it's also a way to map out at firms and industry to understand the differences across firms. All right. So again, I always hate to sort of read. This is actually a part of the exhibit. This is actually in the reading, right? So I just want to highlight these ideas. Understand that you can look at adaptation, aggregation, arbitrage in terms of first the competitive advantage. What's the point? Why are you trying to globalize? We've already talked about that, right? Adaptation is about local relevance, customized to the individual market. Aggregation is about economies of scale across markets, right? Arbitrage is about buy low, sell high, right? Make sure you take advantage of differences and specialize certain activities in different countries. So, but then there's these two C's that'll come up later as well, configuration and coordination. We talk about this, this goes back, these two C's of global strategy actually go back, decades. They think about configuration, this idea of where should we locate our operations, and coordination is how should we connect them? How do we actually coordinate them? Who reports to whom? What sort of coordination has to happen? Well, the configuration, the reality is that the configuration, according to Gemwatt, for adaptation and aggregation is basically locate wherever you have a minimal distance, right? The cage distance, right? Cultural, administrative, geographic, economic, right? You want to locate where in countries that don't have a great distance from your home country. For arbitrage, however, that's not the goal. It's a consideration, right? But the reality is you want to locate your labor-intensive activities where there's low labor costs. You want to locate your R&D activities where you have a comparative advantage in R&D. You want to locate your sales activities where you have a comparative advantage in sales. So you locate your different activities where there's a comparative advantage in that activity area. And then finally, coordination. Again, logically think about this. How do you connect? Who talks to whom in your organization, right? If you have an adaptation strategy, right? So it's all about you're adapting to this market. And suppose, again, suppose you have multiple businesses in different, you have multiple business units in different countries, okay? Well, if you're customizing to say Thailand, right? You're going to want to make sure that all your businesses in Thailand talk to each other. So the coordination is going to be by country because you're trying to optimize for that country. Aggregation is the idea you're trying to do the same thing across countries, right? And generate economies of scale. So now you want the different businesses, or for a given business, you want them to talk across countries. So if you sell this particular product across multiple countries, right? You want all of those business units to talk to each other, coordinate that way. And finally, here the idea is arbitrage is about by function. Here you're breaking up your organization by activity. Certain activities are located here, certain activities are located here. We're going to see for the Intel case, for example, assembly and test. They have assembly and test in China. They have assembly and test in Malaysia. They have assembly and test in, well, they're talking about building it in Vietnam and Thailand, et cetera. Those guys should talk to each other because that's what matters. They're trying, so at the functional level, those are the parts that will talk to each other by function. Right. All right. So that's the AAA triangle framework. Again, understand that aggregations, these aren't necessarily new. It's sort of old wine in new bottles. Aggregation is basically the old global strategy that Bartlett talked about. Adaptation is the old multinational strategy, customized to each nation that Bartlett talked about. But arbitrage is sort of a new, it's not really covered by the integration responsiveness framework. But there is now, in the last one I gave you the reading from Ghoshal, and he talks about his organizing framework. He doesn't have a good fancy name for it, no acronyms here, right? But this is an article. I gave you this article because even though it's technically, I often will give you supplemental articles from academic journals, right? But this one is, even though Strategic Management Journal can be very academic, This one he actually says, no, I'm not writing for academics. I'm writing this article for practitioners. I'm writing this article for managers who are trying to figure out their global strategy, right? And and in particular, he's trying to integrate a lot of views on global strategy. So it felt like this article would give you, be able to basically kill multiple birds with one stone. But so he talks about, so let's talk about Ghoshaal's framework. So Ghoshal says this. He says, look, most important is across the top. What is your source of global competitive advantage, right? If you're going to have a global strategy, why? How does being global give you an advantage? Remember, back in corporate strategy module, I said to you, the benefit of a corporate strategy has got to be ultimately translated at the business unit level. Corporations do not compete. Business units compete. So what is your corporate headquarters, what is your corporate operation to actually benefit you at a business unit level? The same is true here. So the idea is, what do you get out of being global? Is it because of, what's driving that? Is it because of national differences? Is that what's driving your competitive advantage? Is it because of scale economies? Or is it because of scope economies? So that's the first thing. And then he says, and then what is your primary objective? Is your objective to be basically better at what you're doing now? Be more efficient at what you're currently doing? Or is it to manage risk? Or is it to be better at what you're going to do in the future? Innovation and learning, right? So a dynamic approach. It's not just about doing a static approach to doing better at what we're doing now, but learning for the future. And the idea is, he says, look, you can sort of figure out, and it's not like you've got to choose one of these 9 boxes, not Hollywood squares here. But the idea is you can characterize a global strategy based on the combination of what's the source of global competitive advantage and what's the strategic objective, right? Obviously, I'm not going to necessarily read every single box to you, but give you an idea. Look, if the source of global advantage is national differences, and you're trying to be more efficient, what are you going to do? You're going to make sure you benefit from differences in factor costs. You're going to locate certain operations in the place where you can get those factors cheaper, right? That's the idea of locating, your labor-intensive operations in a place with low labor costs, right? Locate your different activities wherever there's a comparative advantage in those activities. I should note this idea of scope economies here. It's important to understand, we've talked about scope economies, right? It's come up on the business unit level, right? Multiple products, you can share activities or costs across activities. So in the module 4, so we talked about scope economies. We also talked about in corporate strategy, different business units could share activities. It could be scope benefit from corporate strategy. Now we have a scope benefit from global strategy. So what we mean is that you get some benefit from having operations in multiple countries, right? So the scope economy is the idea that there's I'm better at operating in Thailand because I also operate in India, right? There's some sort of scope economy across my global locations, right? And so, well, if that's true, what sort of things do you share, right? Well, one thing is a brand name, for example. One asset you can share is a brand name. There's some brand that shares across countries, right? But there's got to be some sort of benefit. Something that's a benefit in India is also in benefit in Thailand or your other locations. That's the idea. That's when your source will be scope economies. When you think about managing risk, right? This idea of think about how you manage risks, right? You basically, if you have national difference, you manage risks. If different nations are different, right? Then the idea is that by managing risk, by putting different operations in different countries, you're less beholden to what might happen in one given country, right? You manage risk that way, right? Scope economies, this idea of, look, you're basically, by operating in different countries, you create a diversification of your portfolio, right? So the idea is I'm selling here, 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 and here. If this one goes to crap, I still got these other ones here, so I'm lowering my risk, but also I'm placing bets, right? I'm creating options. We saw Walmart losing money in China and South Korea, right? I bet you they stick it out for a while, right? You're creating an option. You're willing to lose money for a while to see how it goes, right? You're creating an option. If it continues to lose money, we get out. But if it succeeds, it could be a great success. So that's, again, the idea of scope economies for managing risk. And lastly, for innovation and learning, right? The idea is innovation and learning, that is, depends on this idea of, obviously, for example, again, picking out scale economies, right? The notion there is you benefit from learning because you do the same thing over and over and over again, and you get better at it, right? I was looking at recently, sort of the learning effects in aircraft production. It's dramatic. It's dramatic how much your costs go down as you produce more aircraft, right? So the idea is your learning is based on producing the same thing over and over again. Here, the idea of scope economies is, again, I learned something because I produced it in Guatemala, and we have this new practice in Guatemala, and that looks like it would also work well in Costa Rica or somewhere else, right? The idea of a scope economy, learning from one market and applying it in another, right? So again, the important point here is to understand that you can classify most global strategies based on what's the source of global competitive advantage and what's the objective. Why are you going global, right? And why are you going global and why does it benefit you, right? And you don't have to fall into one bucket. You could fall into multiple buckets. But again, all these frameworks will get you to understand thinking about this idea of global strategy. All right, and all right, so we covered, and again, so I gave you, you'll sort of see the scale economies is very similar to the aggregation and global strategy. The notion of scope economies being your advantage, that is like the transnational strategy, right? The idea of identifying where the advantages are across different, where you have opportunities to share activities and assets across your different countries. And finally, national differences, it's all about arbitrage. Arbitrage is about exploiting national differences. All right. Any questions on that? Right. So the last thing we want to talk about is actually this bottom thing, about national differences. Right? And so this is sort of teeing you up for Monday, right? Because now the idea is if we are pursuing an arbitrage strategy or an advantage based on national differences, where we're choosing to locate different activities in different locations, right? How do we go about doing that? Right? So, so the idea here is, the first thing I want to understand is some of you may or may not have been exposed to this idea of the value chain. And so I want to just put it out there, right? When we did the sort of activities, how you catalog activities, when we did the Coors case, we did it by activity system maps, right? Remember all those balls and the lines, right? That was the idea of activity system map. Well, the older way, if you will, of cataloging activities was the idea of the value chain. So the idea of thinking about, if we actually catalog activities for our organization. So this goes back to, again, this is an idea from the 80s, right? But the idea is, look, when you think about your activities as an organization, it's very easy. People often just think about operations and sales. We make something, we sell it. If I said, tell me about your activities, what does your firm do that you're looking at? Well, we make something and we sell it, right? But the reality is, you guys say, wait a minute, there's more to it than that. Obviously, you make it, you got to get it outbound to get the sales, right? It's got to get from the factory to the customer, right? In some sense, right? You also, by the way, you also have inbound logistics, right? All of your material and everything that's coming in to your operations. Don't forget that after you sell it, the game's not over, right? You don't Boeing or Lockheed Martin doesn't sell us an aircraft and say, see ya, right? You've got after-sales service, right? So again, this is the idea of these primary activities, all the way from inbound logistics out to after-sales service, right? And then the hidden activities are these ideas of support activities that think about whether it be financing, planning, investor relationships, HR management, right, technology development, right, procurement. So behind the scenes, there's other support activities, right? But the idea was, this is the idea, they talk about the value chain. They're talking about this tool for sort of cataloging the activities of an individual firm. Right? Globalization is this idea that you sort of say, we don't need to do all this in one country. Now we can say, look, we've got to do all those things still, but we can choose where to locate certain elements. Maybe it's better to do our production in this country. Maybe it's better to do after-sales service here. Maybe it's better to do our research, our technology development here. You get to choose the countries where you want to locate activities. And how do you choose? That's the idea of going back to our 2 C's, configuration. What do we do where? How do we configure our activities across the global landscape? And then coordination. How tightly do we tie together activities in different locations, right? How do we actually coordinate across different locations? Right? And so the idea here is, like I said, is that there are reasons that you might want to integrate. You might want to keep it all of this in one country. Why? Because certain activities, for example, benefit from co-location or being nearby, proximity, right? It may be that there's a cost. If things get too far apart, there's too much cost to coordinate, right, between these 2 activities, right? I got to have high transportation costs. Maybe it's hard for me to communicate or coordinate. Maybe we have different time zones. Maybe I really need to make sure we have just-in-time delivery, so I've got to be able to communicate with you very quickly. The idea is that proximity will allow for coordination, which then allows for speed, right? And if that's important, you might want to co-locate those activities. But there's also these drivers for disintegration, right? Because the idea is that think about it, what makes you good at R&D does not necessarily make you good at sales, right? Why should your sales and R&D be part of the same organization? What makes you good at design does not necessarily make you good at production. So you may want to locate those differently, right? Because again, the resource or capability requirements for each stage will vary considerably. And different countries will have a comparative advantage in different activities, right? So you realize, one, we don't need to do these under the same roof, and two, they don't even need to be in the same country. And so that's the idea of disintegration of the value chain, right? You may have, this slide was in some of the slide decks for the last class, right? The idea of comparative advantage, right? And so when we think about comparative advantage, we tend to talk about it, we've talked about it sort of the idea of in terms of products, right? So this is a measure of the revealed comparative advantage for selected products across different countries, right? And so this idea of, look, how much, it's measured by how much you export of that product, how much of the world export market are you in that product relative to how much of the overall world export market are you, right? So the idea being, Switzerland, exports 40 times more watches than it does, its share of the world watch market is 40 times larger than its share of any other, of the whole global economy, right? But this shows you that, again, certain countries will focus on individual. Australia is very big in cereals, right? So is India, right? You see pharmaceuticals. The green is anything that's above a 2, right? So I highlight anything above a 2 in green. That means what does the 2 mean? It means that my share of global exports of that product is at least double what my share of other global exports is, right? So I specialize in that product, right? But again, the idea is that certain countries will have a comparative advantage in certain products. So one way we measure comparative advantage is in terms of, one way to look at it is in terms of how you're positioned in terms of the global market in that product. Another one, instead of product, is input. In particular, one, labor, right? You actually have a version of this in your reading, but this is updated 2012 now. You can look at the labor cost in manufacturing, right? Switzerland is the most expensive down to Philippines here, at least among these countries, right? And we sort of see there's certain countries that have significantly lower labor costs than others. And so you have something that requires low-skilled but lots of labor, you're probably going to want to locate it down here, not up here, right? So another way, first way to measure comparative advantage is in terms of end products. The second way to measure comparative advantage in terms of inputs. The third way to think about is the idea of comparative advantage at different levels of the value chain. What I mean by that is if I said to you, who has a comparative advantage in knitted apparel? Right? Who's really good at that? If you looked at the end product, you would say China and Bangladesh, right? So again, this is a ratio of exports, imports, exports minus imports over exports plus imports, right? But the idea is these guys, right, are really big at exporting knitted apparel. So you might say they dominate that. Well, not really. They dominate the end product. Where's the cotton come from? United States. Where does the spun cotton come from? Also United States. Where does the knitted fabric come from? Well, it looks like here Korea's got a big role there. Right? And then the point is that as it goes through from cotton all the way to knitted apparel, different countries have different advantages at different levels of that value chain, different activities. Right? All right. Product, input, different elements, different activities. Different countries have different comparative advantages. That's what's motivating location choice. Right? And you see, again, just to give you some idea, you're going to actually put yourselves in the shoes of Intel on Monday. They've got to choose where they locate their assembly and test. But we all sort of have seen things like this. Where does the iPhone come from? The answer is everywhere. Right? Different components come from different countries because there's a comparative advantage. They have an advantage in that particular area. Right? Everything from design in the United States down to assembly in China. Right? You might have seen this is sort of interesting about the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. Where do different elements actually come from? Everything from, a lot of it is good old Oklahoma, but some of it is Sweden, Japan, Italy, right? Even Chengdu, China for the tail rudder, right? The idea is all these parts of your Boeing 787 come from all over the world, right? Because those particular locations have an advantage in doing that. The one that I got very amused by this, right? So far we got, okay, airplanes, iPhones, very complicated things. How about tennis balls? Where do the tennis balls at Wimbledon come from? The answer is everywhere. So look at all these different countries, from USA, New Zealand, UK, Greece, Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia. The reality is that the tennis ball, with all the inputs, who knew what went into a tennis ball? The tennis ball they play with at Wimbledon has traveled 50,000 miles by the first time they take their swing, the first time they serve, right? So even products that don't seem very high tech can be globally sourced all over because of this idea of comparative advantage. Right. So I think it's the last slide I have. Yeah, it's the last slide. So what does that mean? So we're going to go into, this will go into more detail on Monday. but just give you some basic guidelines now. When we think about this idea of configuration and coordination, in other words, where do we locate our different activities and how do we coordinate them? You will tend to want to centralize those activities that are scale sensitive, right? The idea is you want to do a lot of it in one location. You're going to centralize that. You're not going to disperse that as much. Also, if it requires communication and coordination, you might have two activities that are different, but they require being in sync, constant coordination. Those two you might also want to concentrate, co-locate. But you will then otherwise want to disperse activities as you can to exploit differences in comparative advantage, to gain access to inexpensive inputs, whether it's a raw material input or a labor input, improve access to local markets, right? You know, we all know if you want to sell in China, you got to produce in China, right? So sometimes you got to get access to the market to sell. You've got to actually do some production there, right? Maybe to tap benefits of innovation, right? That is, they know stuff that we don't know. If we have a presence there, we can learn from that base of knowledge. And of course, we've got to think about political and regulatory obstacles. How do we manage those and overcome those? That will also affect your location choices. And then how do you coordinate, right? In the end, you want to grant autonomy to your individual business units in different countries, right? You know, when the local needs and conditions vary, right? When the reality is what you want to do in Thailand is different than what we want to do in Costa Rica, don't be heavy-handed. Let them customize. To the extent that the benefits of local responsiveness outweigh the gains from standardization, right? That goes back to the integration versus responsiveness framework, right? How important is it to be responsive to the local market, and how important is it to standardize or integrate across globally? All right. That's it. Any questions? All right, ladies and gentlemen, enjoy your IS day tomorrow, and we'll see you on Monday when we actually talk about the activity location for Intel. Thank you.